Good afternoon. My name is Edward Hughes. I'm the president of the Harvard Business School Club of San Diego. Welcome to our CEO Forum. We're delighted you're here today. Our mission is to continue to educate leaders who make a difference in the world and make San Diego a great place to live and to work. I want to thank our sponsors, City National Bank, Latham and Watkins, Dowling & Yankee, KPMG, Hughes Marino, and the Honor Foundation. Again, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. These are certainly challenging and very unusual times, whether it's COVID or whether some of the things are going on in the news from yesterday from the Capitol. Very difficult times, and we're going to have a very interesting talk coming up today from someone who's an expert on this and talking about the news on trial, fake news versus real news. So it's going to be a really topical time to have our guest speaker here today. So let me talk a little bit about our mission. As I say, our goal is to continue to educate leaders who make a difference in the world and make San Diego a great place to live and work. And we do that via three kind of core programs. We do our CEO forums, which have turned into virtual forums over the last year for obvious reasons. And frankly, it's been very successful. We've had an opportunity to get some really terrific speakers do that. And that's obviously to continue to educate leaders and to learn about what's going on. Secondly is that we want to share kind of knowledge and expertise, and over the last 7 or 8 years we've been doing management development programs to basically share a little bit of the Harvard Business School philosophy and teaching methodology relating to cases, and we do that both in the for-profit and in the nonprofit sector. Those have been put on hold at this time, but we're hoping that we can get back to in person a program for the for-profit community back in the fall of 2021. And the third thing is, we basically have a very strong social enterprise initiative where we believe that helping support the nonprofit community here in San Diego makes us a better place to live and work. And we do that through a couple of different areas. And this is a chart that I like to share with people because and the red columns or the red bars are basically our investment in leadership in nonprofit leaders, where we've had the opportunity over the last 15 or so years to send about 38 nonprofit leaders back to Boston to the Harvard Business School for a week-long program called Strategic Perspectives in Nonprofit Management. Last year was the first year we hadn't done that in a long time because obviously the program unfortunately was canceled. But we're hoping it's going to start again this year, and we're going to be looking for names for people or applicants to basically participate in that program. That deadline will be by, I think, March 31st is our traditional deadline for that. The second thing we've been doing is we've been donating cash, which is the green part of the columns here, more recently, particularly as we've been developing the management development programs to help support nonprofits. And so those have been going out to nonprofit organizations, which obviously are doing a fantastic job helping this community. So in total, we're getting close to $500,000 of investment into leadership and into local nonprofit organizations. As I say, our schedule has been virtual, and we've had a very good list of people over the last year. We've run on a academic year, so Bill Doyle from Novacure, Bill Salmon from HBS, Bill Hackman from Pershing Square, Francis Fry, we're hoping that we can get, was postponed, hopefully we can get rescheduled into Q1, maybe Q2. We had Kevin Sneeder, the Global Managing Partner of McKinsey and Company, Robert Engel, a Nobel laureate, Professor of Economics. Today we have Lorie Hearn, CEO of inewsource, and I'll introduce her in just one second. And then in about 12 days, we have David Marino and John Jarvis talking from Hughes Marino, and they're going to be talking about the impact that COVID-19 has had on the office space and the commercial real estate marketplace. So that's going to be interesting and very topical as well. So today's meeting is going to be, a presentation. I'm going to switch over to Lorie in a second. And then there's going to be a Q&A. So as we get to the Q&A part of that, please feel free to type your questions into the question tab. I'll be moderating those questions. This will be a recorded session. It will be available to members of the club immediately after once we post it. And then we've made the decision that 30 days afterwards, we'll make it available on our YouTube channel, the HBS Club YouTube channel, to everybody. So With that, let me introduce Lorie. Lorie is the CEO and editor of inewsource. She is founded this investigative journalism nonprofit. She is a career reporter, basically worked for San Diego Union Tribune for many years. Now she was a Metro editor and the senior editor for Metro and Watchdog Journalism. She's building the inewsource organization, which is very interesting. A good colleague of mine on the board introduced Lorie to me, and that's Connie Bayer. And Connie Bayer's heard Lorie speak about fake news. And I thought this would be just a fantastic opportunity for our club and our audience to hear about this, because some of the things that are going on in the world and some of the things that happened in this election and all the fake news going into it it's been really quite challenging and distressing. So, Lorie, welcome, and maybe you can help us learn a little bit about what's really going on with the fake news.
Thank you, Ed. I really appreciate that. And I should mention that although I did not attend Harvard or Harvard Business School, I was a Nieman Fellow. For those of you on the call who know about Nieman Fellows at Harvard University, I was a Nieman Fellow in 94, 95. Life-changing experience for me. Re-energized me in the journalism field and inspired me to become an editor. So I have much to be grateful to Harvard for. So I will share my screen. There we go. So I have to start today with this. Okay, got to figure out. Oh, there we go. With this, you can't ignore the fact that my talking to you today about misinformation and disinformation and fake news is really highly coincidental. So much changed yesterday. I'm still reeling from it. Maybe like you, I stayed up late last night taking some comfort in watching the monotonous but strangely soothing counting of the electoral votes. It was such a contrast to what we had been watching all day yesterday. And watching that vote count was a quiet reassurance, at least to me, that things were still right with democracy and the institutions we rely on to protect us and to work for all of us. This introduction is not about reciting an editorial. I'm a journalist, and as I have so often told people throughout my career, that I'm not in the business of giving opinions. Of course, I have them. Everyone does. We're human beings. But as a reporter, a journalist, I need to back away from some of those almost every day and attempt to give you the unvarnished facts. Excuse me. That said, freedom of expression is a bedrock of the Constitution and our democracy. That's why the founding fathers said people should be able to speak out without fear of retribution or persecution. There are limits, however, when it comes to hatred and inciting violence. It's our responsibility as journalists to expose deceit, particularly by people who have power. We need to help people help themselves as well. So today I'm going to try to talk about my lifelong passion to help inform, to sort fact from fiction. And I betray my age when I say I have more than 40 years in the business of searching for what is true in a world of well-intentioned people, but also people dedicated to obfuscation. I'm not going to wade into politics today, although some of you may want to when we get to the Q&A part of this presentation. And it feels weird to try to steer clear of things when everything is so fresh. But I'm going to talk about information, disinformation, and misinformation, and offer you some ways you can tell the difference. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the newsroom I founded more than a decade ago, and perhaps burnish some of the credentials I have to talk about this subject. So when I was a kid, I was fascinated by newspapers. And I actually knew I wanted to be a reporter from the time I was 12 years old. And I was putting out a newsletter for my Girl Scout troop. And I love to know things before everyone else and tell everyone about them. And as I grew older in high school and college, my definition of journalism became much more sophisticated. So today, I started inewsource because there's a huge problem. And this is it. Newsroom staff across the country has been cut by 51% between 2008 and 2019. 51% of newsrooms are gone. It's gone from 71,000 to 35,000 staffers. 11,000 alone were cut in the first 6 months of 2020. More than 250 newsroom positions have been cut at the Union Tribune in the last 10, 12 years. And you might say, well, why is she telling me that there's so few reporters? That must mean there's less news. And why am I being bombarded every day by social media and my email and my news notifications? It seems like there's just so much all the time. But I would ask you to look at that and say, there's a 24/7 news cycle. That means lots of news, lots of the same news. If you look at your feeds, it's giving you the same news over and over again, but very little depth and very little context. To move back for a second to the 250 jobs cut at the Union Tribune, when I was the Metro editor of the Union Tribune in the late 90s and 2000s, we had more than 400 people in the newsroom and 100 people in the Metro section that covers all the local news. Today, I think there are about a maximum of 150 people in the entire newsroom. So that tells you, underscores the question I often ask, and that is, you don't know what you don't know because there's nobody watching. There is good news. Digital newsroom staffs, that's online native newspapers, have grown by 117%. That's great news, but the numbers are really small compared to the numbers of journalists that have been lost. It's basically gone from 7,400 journalists to 16,000 in 2009. So it's a great increase, but it's truly not enough to replace what was lost. There's other good news as well, and that is that many of these digital newsrooms are nonprofit newsrooms. I was part of the initial nonprofit conversation around news in 2009 when 27 of us got together around a table at the at Pocantico, the Rockefeller estate outside New York, to talk about this new concept called nonprofit news. And today there are more than 300 nonprofit newsrooms. So a little bit about inewsource. inewsource is 11 years old. We turned 10 last November. We are a nonprofit. I founded it to fill the void in investigative and accountability journalism in this region. Our mission is to serve this region with deeply reported stories that will result in positive change. So we have our own website, but how does our small staff amplify our work? We have collaborators, not competitors. We have a primary partnership with KPBS, television and radio. We can reach more than 1 million people a week through their channels. We have a commercial television memorandum of understanding with CBS 8. And we're also published in a network of community news outlets. And we worked with NPR nationally and PBS NewsHour nationally. So we've had some impact. Just a couple examples of some of the stories we've done. We did a story that focused on the lack of PPE early in the COVID days in community clinics and hospitals here. And as a result, an importer, a local importer saw our story and had already ordered 2 million N95 masks that were intended for other clients across the country. He saw our story about the need locally and diverted that shipment to local needs. Our 2020 election coverage was not about daily coverage. We don't do daily coverage at inewsource. We really focus on kind of the bigger accountability issues. And we looked at election security in 2020, and we focused on changes to the voting procedures and voting places. And we put out information both in English and Spanish. And we have a full-time infrastructure reporter. And this reporter's job is to basically look at the infrastructure of this region, which is the quality of our life. If your streets and sidewalks beneath your feet are crumbling, I suspect the quality of your life is crumbling as well. And our reporter digs deep into how money is being spent by different government agencies on infrastructure. So our goal at inewsource is to be the most trustworthy news source in the region. And why? How do we achieve that? We do meticulous fact checking throughout the reporting process and at the end of the story, in the fact checking process before publication. We do pre-publication review for our investigations. We have an attorney on retainer who takes us through the paces before a story is published. And if there is an issue with a story, if somebody contends there are mistakes or implications that need to be corrected, we correct things right away. We also have a method called transparifying the story, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And we're the only one, I think, that actually goes to this extent to transparify our major investigations. One thing I don't have on the slide here, but I'll mention is we're the only news group in this region that has just become a member of the Trust Project. And that's a project, an international project that helps to educate the public about what they can believe and what they can't believe. And they have a set of ethics and protocols that if you qualify by being fully transparent in your news organization, you kind of get their trust stamp on your work. And if you go to our website, you'll see a little T that's a sign of the Trust Projects basically passing their tests for trustworthiness. So I'll dive now into fake news. And I've talked about misinformation and disinformation, but fake news, number one, it's not new. It's been around for hundreds of years and it's here to stay. I'm going to give you some tips on protecting yourself from fake news or misinformation or disinformation. And there are two things I'd like to say here at the outset. The media has to take responsibility, absolutely, for sure, for disinformation and misinformation. But you also must take responsibility. You have to be careful about the news that you share with others. Asking yourself, how do I know this is true? Just because it appears to be a legitimate website or it's coming to me from a friend who's passing on something that's very interesting, but maybe surprising. You need to ask yourself, should I believe this and should I share this with other people? Should I proliferate this particular information? So fake news. According to some politicians, as we know, fake news is any journalism they don't like. But what is fake news really? Fake news is intentionally deceiving. It's completely fabricated. And this is disinformation also, as opposed to misinformation. Misinformation is often inaccurate information that's passed on unwittingly, that you don't have an intent to deceive people or steer somebody wrong. Disinformation is wrong information that's passed on with that intention. It's a really simple example I can give. Say you're going to attend a party that you know starts at 8 o'clock, and you tell somebody, "Oh yeah, that I think that party starts at 9." Well, that's misinformation, right? You're thinking it's true, and you're telling them that that's what you think. But if you say to somebody that you really don't want to come to the party, "Oh, that party starts at 10," that's disinformation. You're intentionally misleading someone. I've just put some headlines down here that have occurred on various websites here. Illegal immigrants started California fires. Obama and Michelle divorce. Trump has the votes, wins Nobel Prize. These are some examples of fake news. But it can also be slanted reporting of real facts. And I would encourage you to pay attention to headlines, or some people call them titles, on stories. I think that's often where you see slanted information that's kind of blown up to make you think it's more interesting or more titillating than it really is. And now we have to ask ourselves the question of, why does fake news exist? And I can go back to the 2016 election and even before that. It exists a lot for money. Some of you probably, I can't see you, but I'd love to see a show of hands of how many people have heard of Macedonia and its role in the fake news industry, literally, during the 2016 election. There's a small town called Veles where lots and lots of teenagers are making tons of money, taking stories that were inflammatory to begin with, generally from right-wing websites, and rewriting them to make them even more inflammatory, and then sharing them on social media. And every time those stories got clicks, it meant money. It meant money. So a lot of fake news is about money. And a lot of these young people who were interviewed said that they didn't care about American politics. They just cared about the money. Fake news also exists to persuade people. That's certainly been in evidence way since before 2016, and has been very much in evidence in the last few years, and really culminated yesterday, as did sowing division. That's another thing that fake news does. It encourages polarization. So I want to help give you a few tips here on how you can protect yourself or spot fake news. Some telltale signs of fake news. Weird endings on URLs. If you call up a story that you get passed on from Facebook or another social media, and it looks like a legitimate news site, but you notice that it has kind of an odd URL, you might want to pay attention to that. And some of these are, .us, .info, some of these are legitimate .net and .co, particularly for international sites, but it's something that should trigger in your mind. Maybe you want to dig a little further. And digging a little further could include the transparency aspect of a news site. I always tell people to look for the about section on a website. I always do that. If I go to a website that I'm not familiar with, the first thing I do is look for the about site, because that'll tell you who's behind the website, what their mission is, when they were founded, who owns them. If it's a really good website, it'll tell you who the reporters are, a little bit of biographical information. It will have a contact us section. It'll have a mission section. If you go to a website that purports to be a news website and you can't find any of these things, this is very telling, and I would be really suspicious. Terrible spelling and grammar. A lot of times fake news, which is generated by people like these teenagers, they're not really great at the English language, and you'll see misspellings in headlines that scream out at you with exclamation points, things like that. Those are generally doctored or made up. Those are usually signs that you should really think twice about reading that or certainly sharing it. Okay, tools for combat. You all have probably heard of these various websites, but one of them is Snopes, which is actually locally based, and it does fact checking. Doesn't fact check everything, but you can suggest things that you would like them to check. It's a good place to go and put a question in and see if they've done a fact check on it. Factcheck.org is also really good, but that's mainly for fact checking what major political figures have to say. And then PolitiFact.com actually won the Pulitzer Prize, as you can see here on their logo, for their innovative fact-checking process some years ago. They look at specific statements by politicians and they rate them for accuracy. This is a website that will do that. A lot of websites like the New York Times will do this now. When somebody is giving a speech live, the president, for example, they'll go through and start fact-checking things in real time. But PolitiFact is the one that has the worst rating for PolitiFact is Pants on Fire, but I would urge you to check it out. Another tool for combat is Google. I mean, we have our opinions about Google for sure, but we are definitely reliant on Google as a search engine. And if you have a problem with, or you're just not sure about something, Google it, put the headline in. See if any other news organizations are covering this story. If nobody else is publishing or covering this story, doesn't necessarily mean it's a scoop on the part of this news organization. It could mean that it's just fake. So Google is a great tool. Oops. Okay, sorry, I just lost my presentation. Give me a moment and I'll get it back. I think we're back. Okay. Okay, more Google tools for combat. Google Images is a really great tool if you're concerned about whether there's a photograph you found that doesn't look quite right. You can actually take the URL from the photograph that you found and put it into Google Images, and it will tell you what the source of it is, what its provenance is. This photo that's used here is widely circulated as a fake picture. It's a combination of two different photos that have been melded of a shark and a storm drain. And this shark actually was taken out in the Caribbean, I believe, somewhere, and melded into this. And this was used way back when the hurricane hit New York, and people were saying, oh, this is what's happening in New York. Not so much. Oh, sorry. Huh. Okay, sorry. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about our Transparify tool. I mentioned this earlier today, something that we kind of invented, and we use it generally on our major investigations. And what it enables us to do is to produce two versions of a story on our website. One would be a normal version of a story that would have some hyperlinks that are important, basically important. If you click this red box that's accompanying that story, the whole story will change and turn red. And that means that every single fact in the story will suddenly become highlighted, and it will link to every source document we have used to develop that story. So we always tell people that you don't have to believe us. You can believe all of our primary and source documents. Could be a video clip, could be an audio clip, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be any kind of a document that helps to back up everything that we have said in one of our investigations. We were the first in the country that we know of to achieve this level of transparency way back in 2013. And we believe we're still the only one that is this transparent about our work. That's not to say some organizations don't do great fact checking, but many of them don't share the results of their fact checking with you. A few other facts you might want to know. Older Facebook users are more likely to share fake news. So Facebook users 65 and older shared more than twice as many fake news articles than the next oldest age group, 45 to 65, and nearly 7 times as many fake news articles as the youngest age group. So we all need to be really careful about what we share with people. Quote unquote conservatives are more likely to share than quote unquote liberals. 18% of Republicans shared links to fake news sites compared to less than 4% of Democrats. The good news is fake news is actually a really small fraction of the overall news diet. So that's the end of my presentation, and I really look forward to questions.
All righty, that's great. Well, thank you for that, Lorie. Very interesting. Let me remind the audience if you can type in the questions to the Q&A. But I've got a couple for you, Lorie, to start with. So
sure, there's so much more to say, but I wanted to keep it focused today.
Yeah. So earlier on in the presentation, you talked about nonprofits versus for-profit news organizations. And so is your thinking that, when I can watch, Fox News and I switch to CNN and they're covering what I think is the same topic, but it's in completely different perspective. So is your concern that for-profit basically organizations are skewing their message to cater to their audience, and so they're doing that deliberately, whereas nonprofits wouldn't do that? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yes, I mean, we can get into the whole television, cable news arena, which I sometimes have a hard time even lumping into the group of real news, because so much of cable news, I look at it and I think it's lots of what I used to call screaming people in chairs. They basically sit around and yell at each other and not even really give a whole lot of real information. A lot of it's just opinion. And yes, so those stations like CNN and Fox and OAN, they cater to a certain audience. that's a valuable moneyed audience through their advertising. Nonprofit organizations, I mean, we're a 501c3. We're not allowed to take political positions. We're not allowed to involve ourselves in politics. Most the nonprofit news organizations that are part of our umbrella group called the Institute for Nonprofit News has criteria, that membership criteria. You have to be transparent. You have to put all your donors' names on your website. There are lots of transparency issues and advocacy, non-advocacy issues. There are many nonprofits that news organizations that do appear to advocate for certain things like the environment, climate change, some things where the writers are really taking a position rather than just having a voice. There are many of those nonprofits out there, but those that belong to the Institute for Nonprofit News really try to be balanced and fair and just the facts, ma'am. Nonprofit news, one of the reasons I started inewsource as a nonprofit was because I looked around and legacy media was dying. The advertising model that had been the goose that laid the golden eggs for so many years was gone. The internet stole the advertising model. Why would you buy an ad in a newspaper to sell your car when you can put it on Craigslist for nothing? So the advertising model in classifieds and display ads just completely blew out. So that's why we started thinking about, well, maybe nonprofit would be the way to go. Maybe we can convince people to support us in exchange for a tax deduction.
Okay.
And inewsource is supported more than 70% by donations from individuals.
Okay. And so second question I've got before I get to some of the questions that are starting to come in is, you mentioned Google as a good way to kind of check this. So I'm sure you've seen Netflix Social Dilemma. And for those of you who haven't, I highly recommend it. But one of the things that absolutely blew me away was if you happen to be a person living in San Francisco and more likely to be a Democrat, and you typed in, is climate change real? You see all these stories about all the horrors of climate change. Whereas if you happen to be a Republican living down in Louisiana and you type in, is climate change real? You see all the stories that pop up about it's a hoax. And so Google is completely manipulating the feed that you get based on your prior preferences. Mm-hmm. So why do you feel like Google is a good fact check place?
I don't say that Google itself is. What I say is Googling things can direct you to places that you can help fact check. If you put something into Google, you'll get a whole bunch of different websites that'll come up. And it takes some work. You've got to look at one of those websites and say, oh, okay, I don't know the name of that website. I have no idea what that is. And you might want to hunt and peck until you find a website that you think maybe you can trust. And then you go to it to see what it says. But you can't just believe me. Google is a master manipulator. And as a news organization, we would love to get out from under the thumb of Google. I mean, we rely on them to basically pick up stories and pass them on to people in the way that you're talking so that you get audience. But boy, we have a lot of problems with Google and Facebook, the tech giants that control all of our lives. But I'm just suggesting that because it's a powerful search engine, it can help lead you to places where you can try to do some fact checking for yourself.
Okay, great. So one of the questions is, you mentioned inewsource as focusing on the region. Where do you look for national news and which can you trust? So where do you go?
Well, I think the answer to that is going to a number of different places. I go to the New York Times, I look at the Los Angeles Times, I look at the Wall Street Journal. I look at Apple News. I mean, I cruise through that aggregation feature, right? I get lots of newsletters every day that are aggregated, but I also look at where they're aggregating from, what news organizations they're pulling their stories from. And I think that the great discerner is, I watch Fox News, I watch CNN, I watch some of these different cable stations because, like you said, it's like two different universes. But I need to know what those universes are saying if I'm going to begin to try to make sense of what's happening in the world. So I think my advice is to look in a lot of different places. And I think that once you land on some news organizations that you feel you can trust, then you can go back to those. But one thing I would say too is, if news organizations tell you you can trust them, and they all do, they all say news you can trust, national news you can trust, we're the trustworthy organization, I would say turn it on them and say, why should I trust you? I mean, I just finished going through a list of reasons why you should trust the stories that we do at inewsource, because we go through all of these steps to try to build your trust, and you can find all that information on our website. I would turn it around on even what you might consider longtime legitimate news organizations and say, why should I trust you just because you've been around for 50 years? Why should I believe what you're doing? Give me the reasons.
Okay. You mentioned Apple News, and I feel like many of the people on this webinar, they get an email each day from Apple, etc. with the news. How do you feel about organizations like Apple suddenly getting into the news, even if it's aggregating it? I mean, is that a role that they should be having?
Well, how do I feel about it? In some ways, I feel hostage to it, right? Because some of us news organizations are stuck relying on these giant aggregators and these giant tech companies to try to get our information out. At the same time, they also censor our information. They were censoring what they considered political stories, and some of them were not even political. They were just reporting on campaign contributions, where you'd get a notice saying we're not boosting your post. So I think we have a really complicated relationship with these tech companies.
Okay. Let me go to the next question. Why are conservatives so much more likely to share fake news?
I can't interpret that. I just know that's what the data seem to show from some of the research we did. Some of you might have theories about that more than I.
Okay. All right. Next is, in the quest for supporting information, can you comment on what local entities are more forthcoming with FOIA requests? And I assume that's Freedom of Information Act requests.
I'm sorry, could you read it again? Are they asking for local agencies? Or?
In the quest for supporting information, can you comment on what local entities are more forthcoming with FOIA requests? So I guess which ones actually respond to them, and local entities.
I can tell you one that never responds.
Who's that?
The San Diego Veterans Administration.
Okay.
No matter how many times we ask them for information, whether it's FOI or straight up questions, just don't hear from them. So, and I could talk a long time about the stories we've done about the disservice that the VA has provided to many of our veterans here with no explanation. There are a lot of local agencies that are very responsive to FOIs, are federal requests for information, and in California, there's the California Public Records Act, and that's what the local institutions are subject to. There are many local municipalities that are very responsive to local requests for information. I'm trying to think about which ones we've had the most trouble with.
I think it's sometimes which ones are the best at providing. So who are the good guys?
I'm not sure who's consistently good, to be honest with you. Depends on what you're asking for. Sometimes local agencies are very good about getting you pretty straightforward information, but if you start to dig into things that are a little bit deeper and more work to compile, that's a toughie. I'd have to talk to my managing editor, about exactly who we think is the best.
Okay, so it sounds like compiling the naughty list is easier than the nice list.
Yeah, it is. It really is. That's because those are the ones I hear about, because when we have an obstinate public official or agency, usually that's brought to my attention because we get our lawyers involved.
Okay. All right. Okay, we've got a question. How viable to you is Epoch Times?
And
And maybe you can tell me, I'm not familiar with Epoch Times, so maybe.
Yeah, I've seen it, but I'm not a regular consumer, so I really can't answer that.
Okay, okay, I'm not familiar with it either. Which story are you most proud of? The follow-up would be why.
Of all the stories we've done, wow, that's tough. I'm incredibly proud of the accountability stories we've done around COVID in the last year. I mean, I can talk about stories we did 5 years ago that I thought were really great. We did a really amazing project called Rewired about a veteran who was subjected to some experimental brain treatments and had a breakdown, and his whole journey and the journey of the doctor who treated him. I'm really proud of that work and the work we've done on risky research. We've done a lot of work looking at research protocols around human trials. But a lot of our accountability work this year around COVID, that's what we do, is we try to look for places where others are not reporting. We did a big piece on deaths that were uncounted but related to COVID that I think would point public officials at places where resources are needed. I was really proud of the one that I talked about a little earlier about the PPE and 2 million N95 masks being directed locally. That kind of impact really makes you feel good because you don't see that kind of tangible impact as often as we would like.
Okay. Well, let me ask you a question relating, and you may have covered this on inewsource. So obviously there's very different views on the benefits of the lockdowns, et cetera. Different states have gone different ways. So has the organization covered that, and where did you kind of come out on, what we in Southern California are doing here?
We haven't specifically looked at the provisions around lockdowns and what, mask wearing and those kinds of things. We've really looked more at the data about COVID cases and how they're being documented and which populations are being hit hardest. We've done a lot of mapping to show where resources are needed, particularly in underserved communities. So we certainly haven't made a judgment on what the protocols should be around COVID.
Okay. All right, I've got a long question. You said, I think that your company tries to make changes, as in mass distribution. Printing the facts can be slanted by the choice of news or facts to report. That is your choice of institutions whose wrongdoing you want to expose. Some stories just don't get reported and thus are assumed by the reader to be unimportant, perhaps incorrectly. Do you have somewhere on your site a list of current changes you are trying to make so that readers are alerted to your own choice of news stories? So I guess someone's asking, are you really advocating certain things?
I think we advocate for the public. We advocate for public health. We advocate for public safety. I can't tell you that we make a list of things we're trying to change or advocating to change because we don't take editorial positions at inewsource. But yes, you're right. When I talked earlier today about biases and everybody has biases, I like to think that as reporters who have been trained in journalism and who have lots of experience in journalism, that we're pretty good at determining what a newsworthy story is, and that is what information can this bring to the public? How can someone gain from this? How can it be useful? And how can it prompt some kind of change that when you expose a wrongdoing or you expose a situation where people are being abused or underserved, you like to put it out there and hope that the people in power will look at that and say, we need to do something about this. We didn't realize people were dying or people were getting sick or people were becoming homeless because of our policies. And I don't think there are very many people out there who would think that there are two sides to homelessness, that, homelessness is a good thing. So I'm not going to put on my website that we're out there trying to end homelessness, because that's not that's not something we would state as a policy. But we do cover homelessness, and we cover how the homeless are treated. and how public health officials who are charged with taking care of the public, how they are taken care of in this situation. So I'm not trying to talk around it, but we don't have a certain agenda that we're trying to achieve certain things. What we hope is that our stories, when we do uncover wrongdoing or systemic things that are broken, or people who are doing things that are against the law, that those things will have, that those stories will have a positive impact that will result in something positive for society.
Okay, great. So everyone keep the questions coming. So as I think you and I were chatting earlier before the webinar started, I've lived in the US now for about 30 years. And I've never seen the news cycle be so swing one way, swing the other way. And as a consequence, you mentioned in your presentation that this fake news creates such division, and we've probably never seen society so divided. How did we get here? Is it the ever presence of social media kind of publicizing this stuff? But how did we get to the situation where you can get two totally different interpretations of a story, and you get people passionately believing one side or the other side, and they are convinced that they are correct?
Well, I think we've always had different points of view. I mean, years ago, for those of you who haven't been in San Diego for a really long time, before 1992, the Union Tribune was the Union and the Tribune. And they were actually both owned by the same family, but had very different editorial policies. And the family believed that the region deserved to have two newspapers with two different points of view, so the public could choose. And the Union was very conservative, and the Tribune was scrappy and much more liberal, and in its editorial page particularly, and some would argue even on the news pages. So I think we've always had that availability for people to go where they feel most comfortable and what they believe in. I think what's happened over the years, and you don't want to blame the internet, but why not? A lot of it's social media, people, and the proliferation of more and more news sites and news outlets. It's everywhere. It just bombards you, and I think people often feel so assaulted with information that they go where they feel most comfortable. You hear about the people who just watch Fox News, or you hear about the people who just watch CNN, because it's where their belief system is comfortable. And I think that's just been reinforced more and more with places you can go on social media, and places you can go on cable news. And I think it would be hard to argue that it kind of came to a head over the last 4 years, when we have things that are constantly pounded home from the leadership in Washington, that these things are this way, and if you don't believe in it, you're wrong. So I think these messages are just, it's like you can tell anybody anything, that this jacket is green, and if you say it enough, people might actually believe it's green. And I think that's what's happened over the years. It's just messaging, constant messaging, and people eating it up.
Okay. All right, got another question. Someone's thank you for the presentation. As you indicated, the decline in newsrooms and journalists imperils the ability for local entities to be held to account. Can you comment on other ways our communities might find independent investigative journalism outside of the inewsource nonprofit model?
Well, I think our model is one that we would love to expand if we had more reporters. I mean, my dream is to have a reporter covering every single one of the incorporated cities in San Diego County, and that's 18 of them. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon, but we need people to tell. I think to find the information, investigative accountability information, is tough, because you don't have trained journalists doing that. There just are that many fewer of them. What we do need are involved citizens who are going to contact us or contact other reporters to tell us what's happening and what needs to be exposed. We can't just sit in the newsroom and divine what's going on. We really need to be in the communities and have you telling us, I hear this is going on, or I'm witnessing this in my city or my school district. And we need somebody who's trained in this in journalism to go see if it's true. And I think some news organizations are actually experimenting with citizen journalists and what they call documenters, having citizens go to a meeting and write about the meeting. I mean, I'm sure most of you rely on journalists for some kind of smart filtering to tell you what's happening. I mean, we could post a transcript where you already can watch a city council meeting where you live on the internet. But how many of you want to sit and watch the whole council meeting for 3 hours? You'd rather have a journalist do that and tell you what was important that happened. So I can only say that I hope that things turn around where we see more journalists. I mean, we have an education program at inewsource where we train interns, the investigative interns of the future, in the skills and responsibilities that it takes to do this kind of journalism. And every one of them that walks out of our door, I just think, I hope they keep at it, because we've lost so much trained journalism in this country, and we need to rebuild that.
And, you know, I think you said earlier, like, you know, journalists are different than opinion givers, you know, but a lot of journalists do have opinions, and they slant their articles one way or another. So how are we going to solve that? We can't just get more journalists, because we need to get, you know, journalists that kind of give us the truth and the story without kind of slanting it.
It's really so hard, Edward, because I see journalists from, you know, the New York Times go on a cable news, you know, talk show and give their opinion about things. Other journalists who you'd look at and say they're a legitimate, high profile, you know, national journalists do the same thing. And I have a problem with that. I think that journalists need to be honest about the fact that they're human beings. But I don't think that we should be, you know, purporting to write a fact-based story and then getting up and talking about doing undue interpretation of what we thought about it.
Right.
I just think that's irresponsible.
Okay. We have a question that says, you have given some very useful tips about how to assess fake news, but it takes time. Is there something we can do on a national level, like understanding fake news educational campaigns? So, I mean, yeah, the news is awful, right? So how do we make it so that, you know, we get some more trust in the news?
You know, there are all sorts of interesting things going on. There are many organizations that are trying to promote news, what I call news literacy. You know, trying to help people understand how they can make their way through the news world and what they can believe and what they can't. There's an organization, a nonprofit called the News Literacy Project, which is aimed at young people in schools, which I think is incredibly valuable. You got to start with the young people. You really got to start middle school or before that, trying to help these internet natives understand how they can navigate the information world. I think that's an incredibly valuable organization. There's something called Trusting News, which is helping journalists figure out how they can be more trustworthy. So there are movements around. There are also some interesting technology endeavors. There's one that's called Veracrypt, that's a startup company by some students from UCSD who are now at Georgia Tech. And they have written some algorithms that can be deployed across a news site and rate that site on bias, on whether the headlines are, and it's all about words and inflections, and we've been working with them as a partner, as a beta project, and they ran their algorithms through all of our content and said that we came out as being incredibly unbiased compared to many other news organizations. So that may be a tool that's ultimately available to a consumer who could use it and run their news feed through it and see, hey, what should I be a little bit worried about?
Okay.
So,
okay, we got a good question here from Dave Kramer. Do you believe that the majority of reporting organizations have a liberal bias? And if so, why?
no, I don't believe the majority do. There are many who have a really conservative bias. So then you're going to say, well, who are the ones in the middle? I think you have to ask them that. Newspapers always prided themselves on saying, oh, we have just the fact-based news in the news columns, and we have the editorial on the editorial columns. But even back in the day, it was tough as a reader to separate yourself in your opinion of that newspaper between what was on the editorial page and really saying, is their news really unbiased? Because bias takes many forms. It's not just in how that story is written. It's about where it's played. Is it on the front page, or is it buried on page 7 at the bottom of the page? Or not on, is it not on a website, or is it headlining a website? I mean, your opinions and your biases are played out in many other ways besides just how the story is written.
Okay, all right. And then, yes, there's the top news organizations are owned by relatively few organizations or families, etc. Do you think we've got
corporations?
Corporations, and obviously the Murdochs have got a big role in some of that, etc. Is that unhealthy? The
Very.
local newspapers have largely, struggled, or they've been consolidated by big corporations. So talk about how you feel about that as a journalist, and the pressures that creates for you as a journalist to kind of conform to whatever that corporation or that individual that owns it.
I think the corporatization, monopolization of news has been really, really damaging to the public's right to information. I mean, just you take an example of a large corporation that owns many small community newspapers or news outlets. They make money by trying to duplicate as much as they can, duplicate content, duplicate services, production. And as a result, the local newspaper probably has less local news in it than it would be if it was owned by a family. The other big problem that I always saw was not having a local owner, not having a publisher who's invested in the community is a big problem. If your newspaper is part of a corporation that's owned by it's based in Chicago, they probably don't care a whole lot about what's happening in Vista or Chula Vista. So I think the corporatization and monopolization of news has really been terrible for the consumer.
Okay. All right. We have a question. Is the New York Times still considered unbiased, or have they slipped in their bias of news articles?
I love the New York Times, but I think, I've seen decisions made by the New York Times. I think some of you are probably really familiar with their decision early on in the Trump administration when they decided to call him a liar, to call out his lies. I mean, that was something that most news organizations would never do, but they actually felt that was a responsible thing to do. I think that if you read some of their writers, I personally believe that the news does tend to have more of a liberal slant. And yeah.
Okay. All right. We always start on time and we always finish on time. So let me finish with this question. Where do we go from here? Because obviously, the events of yesterday, a lot of stuff's been leading up to that. I think everybody, whichever side of the political aisle, could agree that the incoming president is a pretty decent guy. Will things change?
And the news, and you mean in the news world, or
in terms of like just being not so fractured, hopefully getting back to a little bit more, good reporting as opposed to bias. Do you see any change because of the administration change, or this is just going to continue?
I don't think anything's going to happen overnight. It's kind of like we all were saying, we can hardly wait to toast 2021 is going to be so much better than the dumpster fire that was 2020. And what we're 6 days into January 2021, and we have an insurrection in Washington. So nothing's going to happen overnight. I do have great hope in the future of nonprofit news. It's growing there by something like one a month. And I think that has some great hope for less biased reporting. But I can't speak about the political divide. I sometimes look at how polarized things are. And I think we can even speak personally to how polarized some things are, even with our own families. And you wonder, how are we going to bridge that? I like to think that if we have somebody in positions of power in Washington, whether it's our local representatives and the president, who are speaking rationally and a level of calm, I like to hope that we'll find our way back.
Well, let's hope so. So we're right on time. So for the audience, firstly, thank you for listening in. Lorie's been kind enough to share a tip sheet for how to interpret fake news versus real news. So we're going to send that out to everybody who registers for this. Also, I'd encourage you to check out the inewsource website and then sign up for the newsletter as well. There's a lot of good information that kind of comes out on our region here. So Lorie, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. We really enjoyed it. It's very topical with everything that's going on, and it's good to get a career reporter, an expert on this stuff to help us try and figure out how we navigate this and try to get our information to be hopefully a little bit more fact-based. So I appreciate you taking the time, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar. I hope you'll come to our webinar next week with David Marino from Hughes Marino, talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the real estate market, and obviously in the San Diego, Southern Cal region in particular. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorie. Take care.
Thank you.